I think we might as well make a start. I'm expecting that people will keep arriving as they finally work out where the foothills are. So do be prepared for people to climb over you. And I'll try not to be put off as the endless amounts of people flood in for this fascinating session. But thank you all for coming on time and finding us. I'm Charlie Rapple. That's not me on the left. And it's really good to be here today. I've got this great panel lined up for you. We've got nearest to me is Adrian Mulligan from Elsevier, and then Andy Nightingale from the Royal Society of Chemistry. And we've all come all the way from Britain to talk to you, which is terribly exciting. And we've tried to put together a panel of talks that cover 3 different approaches to market research. And I guess that's the first point, is we seem to have been strangely listed in the programme under something to do with international sales. So if you're here for international sales, sorry, that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about market research, so feel free to leave, as I thought Melanie was about to do that. But yeah, we're going to talk about 3 different approaches really to market research. I'll cover why you might want to get closer to customers, and provide some kind of rudimentary guidance on how you can do some of this for yourselves, the kind of the do try this at home section. And then Andy's going to talk about what's possible if you've got a little bit more resource at your disposal. And Adrian's then going to talk right up to the relatively big undertaking of running an online community, which is probably the don't try this at home bit, I guess. So that's really the structure of the session. We'll probably do about 20 minutes each and try and allow plenty of time for discussion and questions. Oh, and I did this deliberately. I've got almost the same slide, which is just to remind me to tell you that my slides are online already at the TBI Communications website, so don't feel that you've got to try and get down anything that's on the screen. You can go and look at those. And also, just to remind you, I've just realised now that my hashtag is completely out of date, because that's the wedding hashtag, isn't it? So 2013 SSP if you did want to tweet during this session. Keep coming in, welcome. So why bother with market research was the question that I thought it would be useful to start with. I kind of hope that if you've come along to the session, you might not need that answered by me, but I thought I'd start with an answer in case anybody's come along to be convinced. And my answer to that is really that we find ourselves in a climate of frustration and maybe of scepticism with many of publishers, customers, readers, librarians, even authors, quite unconvinced of the value that publishers add. And I think there's a sense that publishers don't listen or don't hear these frustrations. So for me, market research gives customers a voice, and at the very least that can help to improve relationships in the information supply chain. And obviously a relationship needs to be a two-way thing where the publisher has a voice but the customers have a voice too. And I think market research also helps us to understand customers better, their behaviours, their expectations, their motivations. And all of that then contributes to helping us as publishers remain sustainable and successful, because if we listen to our customers and we understand them, then we can develop strategies and products that make customers happy. So for me, it's kind of a no-brainer. We should all be taking the time to research and to understand our markets. But I think a lot of publishing organisations still don't. So I thought it would be useful just to talk through the reasons why not. When I ask people why they don't do market research, as I did prior to this session, these were some of the most common reasons I heard. So people say, well, our editors are scientists, they know the field. Or they say, well, our sales folk are out there all the time talking to our customers, so they're picking up any intelligence that we need. And then people say, outsourcing market research is just too expensive, but we don't have the skills to do it in-house. So those were kind of the 4 main reasons I heard for people not doing market research, and I thought it would be useful to consider each of those. So firstly, are we really confident that our editors' knowledge is up to date and representative of all the different audience segments that exist now, and probably always did to an extent, but I think we've seen a lot of diversification of our markets. I mean, just thinking this morning about the newer audience segments that you'll see emerging from the MOOC world, it makes me question whether our editors are really as up to speed as we think with our markets. And I know that salespeople themselves would say that, you know, they're not out there primarily to be understanding understanding user preferences. They're out there to understand purchasing behaviours and make sure they can do the best possible job of aligning a company's strategy with those purchasing behaviours. So I think we have to acknowledge that, yes, our editors and our sales teams know the market to a point, but they're not there to provide research per se. And then in that context, I think it's useful to remember the difference between intelligence and research. And market research is designed specifically to inform a particular project, a particular strategic development, whereas intelligence is an ongoing activity. It's something that you're constantly just gathering ideas from the ether. Both of those are equally important, both of them are equally valuable, but you can't start to build a new product based on intelligence, which might be sort of anecdotal or a bit diverse, a bit fragmented. And then on this side of the slide, I know that obviously publishers' societies have limited resources for doing market research. There was a survey last year of market research professionals, and it showed that in the publishing sector, market research budgets have decreased by 5% or something in the last year. And in fact, that was attributed in part to the increase in the sort of DIY research solutions that I'm talking about today. So I know that people have less budget for outsourcing, but I think it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be expensive, that if you can take on some of the work in-house and then just outsource part of the package rather than throwing the whole research project over the wall. And you can get valuable and actionable insights for less than the cost of exhibiting at an event or something like that. So I think you have to put it into the context of all the other ways that you're trying to engage with your market, and actually research doesn't always come up as expensive as you'd think, and you can do more yourselves than you think. On which note, let me move on to some of the practical guidance that I'm going to share today for getting closer to our customers. So I thought it would be helpful to start with just a quick snapshot of the various techniques for gathering customer insight. Obviously it's not exhaustive. I'm not going to go through the entire litany of market research methodologies and techniques. I've picked out the few that I think it's realistic for publishers to undertake in-house. And there are two main types of market research technique. We talk about exploratory and confirmatory techniques. And it's really important, I think, to separate and to understand the difference between the two, because they will give you different kinds of results, so they suit different kinds of research goal. Exploratory research, which is what this slide is about, is things like interviews and user observation and focus groups, things like that. And that will help you kind of explore the topic and kind of generate initial insight and really dig into the depth. Whereas the confirmatory techniques that I'll start to talk about in a moment are about getting more precision then and broadening out your findings so that you can be clear that they're representative and valid. And so you'll need a combination of both, and you can't try and force one means to the other end. So a lot of people think market research, survey, and then try and use a survey to explore a topic and get insight from an audience, and it just really doesn't fit that. And by the same token, you can't hold one interview and then sort of extrapolate from that to your entire audience. So you need to get the right tool for the job. So the exploratory techniques, then, I'll just go through these separately in a little bit more detail. They enable you to get deep into the topic and to probe and test and follow kind of unanticipated directions shaped by what you're finding out as you go along. So for me, when I'm starting a research project, I'll typically start with some secondary research, and that really means Google, for starters. So I'll start Googling around looking for any existing studies on the topic, and they might be by kind of governments or funders or trade associations like SSP or ALPSP, even academic research centres. I'll also look back through my email archive for all those LibLicense postings that I think, oh, that'll come in handy one day, and file in a massive folder called intelligence that then just gathers electronic dust. And I'll look through web bookmarks, all the stuff that I've put into Delicious, and then try to port into more suitable bookmarking tools. I'll look through all the stuff on my desk, all the kind of piles of magazines and reports that, again, I've kind of thought, oh, I'll get around to reading that one day. I'll also ask my colleagues, a useful source of intelligence, and really just anybody I know. I'll kind of really go to the network at this point and phone up sales agents from regions that I'm less familiar with to get their take on an issue, or I'll phone up kind of other partners and vendors that I've worked with over the years. I might even phone a friendly librarian, or even an unfriendly librarian sometimes. So I'll really take advantage of every possible kind of general channel that I can think of just to get my head around the topic and get a grip on it. And then I'll do what I call rumsfelding, which is going from getting the grip on it to starting to sort it into my known unknowns and my unknown unknowns and all of that. I only realised quite recently that was a model called, is it the Johari window? And I thought Donald Rumsfeld invented that. I didn't realise that actually he just really mangled an attempt to describe it. But yeah, so it's rumsfelding at this point where you just kind of boil down, all right, I'm fairly confident about this stuff, or there's fairly good data already out there to explain that, but I still have questions in these areas. So I still have all these unknowns, and that's what I'm going to focus my research on. And that will kind of build on and clarify what I've learned from the secondary stage, and identify the threads that I'm going to pull further. And then I'll go into observation mode sometimes, which means that I will go and either undertake a quite formal process of user observation. So if it's product-oriented, I might actually video or watch some users using a website or using an app or something, and take notes about what they're doing so that I can get this kind of unfiltered first-hand understanding of that. Because if you ask people what they do with a website, they'll give you a really different answer to what they actually do with it if you watch them. So I'll undertake some user observation if it's that kind of research. And I love focus groups. It's so fascinating to get a bunch of people in a room and hear how off-piste they go, and find out that they gave you all these different opinions when you talk to them one-on-one as individuals, but get them in a room and that starts to boil up into something very different, and there's all kinds of sparks off each other. So this is a really fascinating way of helping to shape the direction of the research, because they between them will identify other things that just hadn't occurred to you that now you want to pull the threads further. And all of this is really about shaping my sense of what are the questions to which I want answers, and I'm going to come on and talk about why it's so important to get your head around that very clearly in advance before you start broadening out the research. But mainly it's because if you're not very clear on the questions you want answers to, if you're too broad when you go out there, you'll just get such a massive deluge of information that it will be really hard to take any insight out of it afterwards. But once I've got the questions pinned down, then it's time to broaden the findings. Then it's time to go to the confirmatory techniques. And the most popular of those is the online survey. I'll also typically look at a lot of usage data and analytics at this point. When I say I will do that, I mean I'll persuade one of my team to do that, because that kind of thing does make my eyes ache after a while. But all of this is then about ensuring that the hypotheses that I've developed in the confirmatory stage aren't biased or unrepresentative. And what I'll often find at this point is that spanners are emerging that are going to throw themselves into the works. And I'll find that something that I thought I understood, I've now got a sudden finding that just conflicts with that a bit, and I'm going to have to go back and do some more exploratory work. So it can be a bit cyclical, and I think it's important to allow for that when you're planning the project, that it's not as linear as exploratory and then confirmatory. There's a little bit of moving back and forwards between the two types of research. So that's the basic process. In my abstract, which I'm sure you've all read, I promised you some quick tips for making this kind of DIY approach work for you. So the first one is that it's about the subject, it's not about you. This is the classic thing that I find when people have started trying to do research for themselves. They've got really hung up on a sort of inward-looking, product-centric perspective, and the questions that they've asked have all been, what do you think of my products, and how do you use my products, and how do my products compare to those of the competitors? And those are questions which might be usefully answered if your research is really product-centric. If you're doing something like user interface research, then that's kind of appropriate. But today we're not talking about that. We're talking more about getting closer to customers in a more strategic sense to shape our vision and our kind of bigger picture. So I think it's important to start at least by taking your own products out of the equation and trying to understand customers from their own perspective, what they do generally, what their needs are generally, not from that kind of product perspective. And it's also too easy to be too general. I sort of touched on this a moment ago, to try and find out too much at once, and to end up with research that is just too broad to be actionable. And Giant Haystacks is probably didn't have a massive career in the US. I don't know. He's a UK wrestler from the 70s, I guess. And that it just came to mind that that's what you end up with. If your research is too broad, you end up with a giant haystack, and it's or multiple giant haystacks, and it's really hard to get any of the needles of insight out because you didn't get a clear enough grip on it in the first place. So when you start, narrow down, think ahead, think about what it is that you're going to need to know at the end of it, and really focus on narrowing down the research problem in support of that very specific finding that you're aiming to get at the end. And this can be really hard if you're trying to do this and you've got colleagues who have an interest in the research and maybe on whose behalf you're doing it, because they'll just give you a really vague brief like, I want to understand the market in China. And you need to help them, or if that's you thinking like that, you need to help yourself think more deeply about what it is that you want to know, and kind of try and boil that down to a research problem. Like, we don't know how to change our website to get more usage from academics in China. And that's kind of, that is at the heart of what people are saying when they want to know more about something, but you need to help them really precisely articulate it. And it is useful to involve colleagues, speaking of colleagues, from the outset, particularly if they're going to be affected when it comes to applying your results. It's a good idea to get them involved in identifying the research problem and agreeing the research objectives. Ask them up front, especially if they're the kinds of people, as some are, who might be sceptical about the role of market research or sceptical about your findings down the line. Ask them up front what they expect to find out. So if your question was about how we're going to change our website to increase usage in China, ask them what they might expect the answers to that to be. Because then, not only will that help you focus when you're presenting your results back to them, because you can not go overboard on the stuff that they already expected to find out, and you can really focus on the unexpected findings, which are going to have more significance for your strategy. But it'll also show them the value of the process if you've got findings that they hadn't, in and of themselves, expected you to have. So work out the research problem, then work back from the answer you want to have at the end of the process to boil down quite specifically what you want to find out and express that as research objectives. So if the problem was, we don't know how to change our website, then your objectives might be identify areas of dissatisfaction with the current website and prioritise the areas of dissatisfaction according to their impact on usage or something like that. So set really clear objectives, verb-oriented. And then if you've spent the time clarifying that problem and those objectives, that means that everybody involved in the project is really clear on what it's trying to achieve, and more importantly perhaps, they're really clear on what's out of scope, because that's the other thing that I find often happens when you're undertaking research, is every man and his dog will turn up in your cubicle going, just while you're doing a survey, could you just ask them about, and you end up with this sort of amorphous beast that's got no direction to it, and at the end of it you're the one stuck trying to do the analysis and make sense of these very disparate questions. So get everyone to agree what the objectives are, and then you can quite politely turn to them and say, I'm so sorry, that is out of scope for this particular project, but I'll be glad to look at that next. So once you've got your objectives, you know what the research problem is, this is when you choose the techniques that you're going to use. And again, it's about the exploratory approaches that will help you explore the depth, and the confirmatory approaches that will help you extrapolate that and give you some breadth. And for example, you need to go back to the research objectives at this point and think, are we trying to find out how many people do something, or are we trying to find out why they do something? And that's two quite different types of research that you're going to need different tools for. The other thing I find is that, as I said, people will often kind of think research, think survey, and say, we're going to do a survey. And that is, the wrong approach. Start by working out what it is that you need to find out, and then decide what's the right way to do it. So start by saying, we're going to do some research, and then when you've really thought through what you're trying to find out, then you can choose whether the survey is the right tool for the job. Top tip here is to keep questions to a minimum. Whatever type of research you're doing, whether it's a focus group or a survey or a tele-interview, you're always going to have some questions that are there to prompt the conversation. And it's really easy to have too many of these. And if nothing, either in a focus group not to be able to get through them all, and then to have this nagging sense of, oh, we never really got to the heart of it. Or in a survey, you find lots of people just dropping out because there's just too much going on. So really distill down, again, in the context of your research objectives, what the key questions are that you need answers to. And make them really specific, really craft them carefully. Don't just sort of say, why do you use our website? Say, what last time you used our website, what did you do next? What did it enable you to do? What did it lead to? And think carefully about the order in which you ask your questions. You want there to be a flow. You want people to be answering these questions in the right context, to be understanding where you're going and therefore able to give you useful answers. You don't want to lead them, and there's a sensitivity there in terms of how you structure questions, and particularly how you structure answer options in surveys. So you don't want to shape them too much in your own expectation of where it's going, but you do want it to kind of follow, so that they're not jumping around too much and getting confused by where the survey's going or the focus group or whatever. Another top tip, really obvious I guess, is just to have somebody else look through your research instrument and make sure that the questions are clearly articulated, that they're unambiguous, particularly if it's going to be for a survey where you're not there in the room with the respondent to help them understand anything. And when it comes to answer options in a survey, make sure that you've been really comprehensive. We've all been there when you try and answer a survey and the question or the answer that comes to your mind is just not there, and you're just sort of stabbing at the screen going, well, none of these. So yeah, make sure that somebody else has had a look through, and I get very frustrated when I fill out bad surveys. Also, just be realistic about how much the research is going to be able to do. Don't ask your customers for your strategic solution, to develop your next product for you. They're not going to be able to do that. They're going to be able to tell you what the problems are they have with the current products they're using. They're going to be able to tell you what their workflows are, what their needs are, things like that. They're not going to be able to put that together for you and say, so this is what you need to do. You're going to have to do that for yourself with your colleagues. So a question along the lines of, what do you think we should do to develop, is just a bit of a waste in any kind of research setting, because they're going to go, I don't know, it's not my problem. Consider early on, and maybe I should have put this slide earlier on actually, but consider early on how you're going to approach the participants in your research. Are you going to email them? Are you going to use adverts or social networks? And make sure that you've allowed sufficient time in your plan to get those communications written and signed off and set up if they're going to be distributed, via email campaigns or whatever. And do use incentives. People often are uncertain about whether it's appropriate to reward somebody for participating in research, but I think it acknowledges that their time is valuable to them and their input is valuable to you. But just use them appropriately. The Market Research Society really frowns on using your own products as an incentive, because there's a sense that you're not really giving that to the customer. You're just, there's no effort for you involved in giving that to them, and all you're really doing is maybe trying to get them to use your product rather than get their insights. So I always just use Amazon vouchers, iTunes vouchers, things like that. Keep it general. And set a short time frame for answering a survey in particular. If you give people, an 8-week window, they'd think, oh, I'll get around to that in 8 weeks' time, and then they won't. But if you give them 3 days, they'll think, if I want to have my voice heard on this, I really should just do that now. So to give them a short time frame, you don't necessarily actually close the survey at the end of that window, because they will get annoyed if they don't pay attention to the deadline, go to the survey and find it's closed. But for you, at least, you'll know that a lot of people will fill it in that time frame, and then you can take the results out at the end of your window. So the analysis bit. You might be doing this yourself, you might be using software to do this, you might have a combination. But again, before you just start wading in and trying to grapple with the giant haystacks, go back to the key questions you're trying to answer and write yourself a plan of how the data can be used to answer that, particularly if you're going to want to do cross-analysis or filtering and take one question and filter out responses that people gave and use that separate data set. That kind of thing is a bit time-consuming, and you don't want to just be doing it rather pointlessly. So write yourself a really clear plan of how you're going to address and analyse each question, and make sure that you understand the time involved and the value that it's going to give you, and you've just done a bit of a weighing up of those factors before you wade in. And when it comes to reporting back to other people, think about who they are, what their context is, and select highlights. Don't just send a massive, big, fat general report round for people to read, because they won't, and all your hard work will go to waste. So schedule a meeting, write a short presentation, half an hour max, focus on the things that were unexpected or the things that you feel are really significant in terms of what the organisation should do next. Give them an executive summary in writing that just sort of says, this is what the research was designed to do, and these were the main findings, and these are my recommendations. And make that and the presentation the main format. Don't spend time creating a massive report no one's going to read. And on that note, just keep it really short and focused, so minimise the amount of data that you put in front of people, and craft it into a story that people can follow. So don't just go through question by question going, we asked this question, we found this. Pick out what's interesting. Sometimes that's like, in question A we had this, and in question B we had that, and I think it's very interesting that we then learn C. So just focus on takeaways and the really interesting points. You can make the data available to anybody who really wants to read it at length, but if you try and put it all on the screen, A, it will take forever, and B, you'll just lose a lot of the audience. And so that's really my final point, is don't assume that the people that you're presenting the research to will have the time or the skills or the inclination to be able to see what seems really obvious to you. You have to help them bridge the gap between information and insight. So you need to kind of draw out the key points and the recommendations and make those really explicit. So this is kind of the end of me. Summary then of the process and the tools that you'll use. So you'll explore the topic with some secondary research. You'll narrow your focus with some tele-interviews. You'll identify the threads that you're going to pull, maybe through focus groups or user observation. You'll get wider input, perhaps with a survey, and then you'll do some analysis to interpret your findings. And the top 5 tips are pretty much as you can see them on the screen. You can just take a picture if you're really keen. But as I said, this is on the TBI website as well. Avoid narcissism, look ahead, be realistic, stay focused, and treat your colleagues like idiots. So a whirlwind whistle-stop tour of market research. I'm now going to allow these guys to tell you a bit more about what they're doing and how they're applying this kind of research into publishing houses. Thank you.